Welcome to the Rewired Roundtable Talk. I am very excited and honored to have a highly esteemed panel with us today. We are joined by experts in the early child development, youth development, and early childhood care and education fields from the World Bank, Yale, Harvard School of Public Health, and R4D Results for Development to discuss youth-led early childhood care and education models in diverse global settings. We gathered to have a roundtable discussion about the why of this approach and how it addresses current challenges faced by both young children and youth, the application of this model in different country contexts, barriers and facilitators, and important considerations and research questions moving forward. So before we begin, we'd like to have a time of introductions, and I can start us off. My name is Han Choi, and I am a student getting my Master's of Science in Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. My research and interests center around early childhood and youth development and ECCE, and I will pass it on to my fellow co-host, Alia, to introduce herself as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Alia Sagir. I'm also obtaining my Master's in Global Health and Population at the School of Public Health at Harvard. And similar to Han, my interests are on early childhood development and caregiving. I'm really excited to be here to co-host.
Thank you. So let's begin with a brief round of panel introductions. If we could ask everyone to please share their names, institutional affiliations, and just to briefly describe the ECCE program that you're affiliated with within 2 or 3 sentences. And so we'll actually go in alphabetical order. And so for the first names, so we'll start off with Dr. Aisha Yousafzai.
Hi, thanks Han, thanks Alia. I'm Aisha Yousafzai. I'm a faculty at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and my research focuses on designing and evaluating interventions that promote children's development. And the most recent work that I've been involved in is LEAPS, where we are working with our partners in Pakistan to train young women in rural communities between 18 and 24 years of age to deliver early childhood care and education in villages where there is otherwise no access to early learning opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Yousafzai. We'll pass it on to Dr. Angelica Panguta.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Angelica Panguta. I am a research scientist at the Yale Child Study Center. Much like Aisha, my work also revolves around early childhood development and education systems and programs. And Aisha and I have been working together in the context of Pakistan, but I think what in particular brings me here today is to tell you a little bit about our experience in the adaptation of that model in the context of Colombia. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panguta. We'll actually pass it on then to Ms. Frances Beaton Day.
Hi, everyone, and sorry again for being late. I'm Fran Beaton Day. I work in the World Bank's early childhood development team at the global level. There's a few different things that we're engaged in. So personally, I'm involved in a couple of different preschool programs across Africa and Asia, which involves kind of the design of the projects and the implementation, working with governments. And then included sort of in that is one of the programs which I think is most interesting for this particular topic, which is around the program we have in Liberia, where we've leveraged a skills and training program focusing on adolescent women and integrated an ECD training track. And then one of the other pieces that we've got going on at the moment is a brand new childcare work program, of which we expect this topic to be really key to leverage various different streams of financing and kind of have win-win opportunities around integrating skills training for practitioners into various different employment and skills programs. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Beaton Day. And last but not least, we'll have Ms. Vidya Pucha.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Vidya Pucha. I'm a senior program officer at Results for Development. And most relevant to this conversation at Results for Development, we co-host the Early Childhood Workforce Initiative with the International Step by Step Association. This initiative is a global effort and multi-sectoral in nature. Some of our aims are around generating new knowledge to support decision makers in supporting a quality early childhood workforce at scale, providing opportunities for cross-country learning, supporting country capacity building, and advocating for sustained attention to workforce issues at country, regional, and global levels. Thanks so much, and good to be here today.
Thank you. It makes me just so excited just from hearing the introductions. So I'm very much so looking forward to our conversation. We'll actually begin by sharing a short video spotlighting community voices of why youth-led early childhood programs are important for female youth in the context of the rural Sindh district in Pakistan. And if you have any reflections while watching the video, please feel free to type them in the chat box as well.
एक बहुत बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है, स्कूल भी नहीं है, दूर स्कूल है और घर में जो मदर्स हैं वो भी सही केयर नहीं करती बच्चों की, गाइड नहीं करती कि स्कूल क्या है, किस तरह है।
नौजवान छोकरियों जेके हूंदियूं माना उनखे इजाज़त न मिलंदी आहे न हितां खां पोइ उन्हनि का छोकिरी अॻिते वधे थी उनजी हिफ़ाज़त ॾिसनि था उनजे करे उनजी ॿियूं बि छोकिरियूं माना दिलि चई थी पोइ वालदेन इतबार करनि था उन ते हेॾा बि सही आहे की असां हिनखे छॾे था सघूं हिकिड़ी छोकिरी सेफ आहे।
नौजवान नस्लनि जी तरक़ी ज़रूरी आहे उहे जो पढ़नि था ऐं उन्हनि खे अॻिते पंहिंजी महिनत कनि था पढ़नि ऐं तरक़ी कनि ऐं ॿियनि नौजवाननि खे बि सेखारे सघनि तव्हां बि तरक़ी कयो जीअं असां पढ़ूं था तव्हां बि पढ़ो।
जी मदद थी सघे घर में माउ पीउ खे पघार जे हिसाब सां त उन्हनि बि कुझु आमदनी में ख़र्चो अची सघे थो पंहिंजी जेकी माना मुतलबात आहिनि माना पंहिंजो ख़र्च पाण करे सघे थो। जज़्बो आहे जेको इंसान खे सुठो इंसान बि बणाए सघे थी ऐं तालीम इंसान जी टी अखि आहे जेको पाण पंहिंजी अखि सां नज़र नथो अचे त उहो तालीम सां पाण खे नज़र अचे थो।
Thank you. So today we are here to discuss these youth-led approaches to early childhood programs. And as we have been experiencing ourselves, the central focus of these programs is to provide benefits to young children through access to high quality early childhood services, while simultaneously promoting the development of these youth. And so this video is actually an illustrative example that reflects the spirit of the discussion that we hope to have here today. And so let's dive into our panel discussion. I will pass it on to Alia to lead us with our first question.
Thanks so much, Han. So I think we'll begin by asking specific questions about your work, program, overall perspectives about youth-led early childhood models. And after each speaker, we'll take short pauses in between for others to share reflections and just generally build on our discussion. So we heard from the youth in the earlier video that one of the main advantages of participating in youth-led ECCE programs was that it allowed them to gain, really valuable skills and provided a pathway into entering the workforce. This also made me think of potential structural challenges that exist within the ECCE workforce generally, which brings us to our first question for Ms. Pucha, which is, what are the challenges you see in the ECCE workforce today? How can countries plan for a skilled ECCE workforce, and what policies do you think would entice youth to a career in ECCE? Loaded question.
Thanks so much. It's a good question, but also a big one. And I guess from the perspective of the Workforce Initiative and from the experience of our consultations with practitioners and policymakers, I think I would point to challenges falling in largely 4 areas. One related to working conditions. On the whole, we see that the workforce faces low pay, unstable terms of employment, and in many cases, they occupy low status, which can reduce their overall job satisfaction and create additional challenges around recruitment and retention. And secondly, I think another challenge is around sort of the foundational nature of policies and systems and not having in place competencies and standards which help to guide understanding of what members of the workforce really need to know and be able to do and to carry out their roles. And those sorts of foundational pieces are often not in place to be able to guide training and recruitment and a host of other things. And I think relatedly, there aren't widely accessible training opportunities and professional development, and where those are available, access is not typically wide, in the sense that people in more formal positions, or for those that are working with older children, tend to have more access. And in addition to that, the quality of these opportunities are lacking, and they aren't as focused on delivering the practical skills that are really needed for doing the day-to-day work. And then I guess building on that gap and challenge around training and professional development, I think the other area is related to kind of having opportunities for regular feedback and coaching that could help skill building and build that job satisfaction, sense of professionalism, and connection with peers. And I guess that tackles the first part of your question around challenges, but maybe thinking a little bit from those challenges, what could be ways for at the policy level to address them. I think that we could think of those 4 areas also as opportunities, and there could be promising approaches in each of those areas that could be explored at the policy level and also within the scope of programs. And I think the key there is ensuring that each of the approaches that are taken are aligned across those areas. So, for example, it's important to kind of have the foundational structure in terms of putting in place competencies and standards, and then also on top of that, training and professional development. But you need all of that together to be able to clearly articulate career pathways for the workforce. And at the same time, working conditions need to be part of the conversation around career pathways. So I think ensuring that all of those potential areas of opportunities are looked at together could be a way of helping to address them. I hope that helps to address the question.
Absolutely. I think your points regarding working conditions, especially, and both recruitment and retention and the opportunities, those 3 in particular really stood out to me and make me think of whether these specific obstacles relate to youth entry in ACCE as well. And so before jumping to our next question for Dr. Yousefzai on this topic, I wanted to see if anyone had thoughts, any reflections.
I might jump in. Vidya, thank you so much. This is such a nice and systematic way to look at a problem and a challenge that is so large. And I think that's why we look at organizations like yours to, allow us, sort of a systematic look, right, into problems that are really systemic and structural. And I really like the way also in which you framed both the barriers and the enablers are kind of one in the same. And I wondered if you could maybe through an example, either in a country or a setting where either one or several of those, enablers or levers, right, were able to, be overcome. And if you could identify, was it effective advocacy? Was it effective brokering of evidence? Was it, what is a tipping point, right, to drive one of those enablers forward? Any example, or it could be not necessarily a country, but either, even within an organization or some of the partners that you work with to help really, illustrate the very, very relevant and important points that you share with us.
Thanks for that question. I think it's a good one, and I think one of the examples that we've come back to a number of times is around the early childhood care and education sector in Singapore and the work that they've done around creating a master plan for the workforce. And I think they've very helpfully mapped out what what the career pathways could look like, and at the same time have put in place ways of, for example, putting in kind of increasing financial opportunities, like providing scholarships for people to actually access different professional development, bringing in, and not kind of unrelated to some of the work that we'll hear about today, but bringing in people who are not traditionally part of that workforce into that as well. So I think having the structure in terms of the policy structure in terms of like a career pathway or a work plan, but then also simultaneously using that to increase opportunities for the workforce that are aligned.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I'll just come in and just some of the kind of things that we've been seeing, because all of this, I think, resonated really clearly, and it's definitely challenges that we're seeing across most countries right now. And I think there's a couple of kind of additional kind of included points within what you're talking about that we see as sort of stumbling blocks for governments as well, because sometimes they stop at the kind of the implementation of a practitioner, or they stop at the development of a practitioner framework and haven't thought through all of the implementation. So kind of when you say that these programs also need to be widely available, that's also the bit, that's often the bit where we see challenges. There aren't enough accredited training providers, for example, and in some cases the government wants to control the training and the rollout of the training, but doesn't have the resources and capacity to do that. There are some other countries where they've taken a more pragmatic approach and have accredited a number of training providers, or found workarounds where they have trained people from the Ministry of Education that are then kind of almost seconded or can be employed as consultants by skills organizations and can roll that training out. But that's often one stumbling block that we see to restrict the full implementation. And I think maybe the other is kind of the importance of these short training programs that can progressively build up to a higher qualification. And there does seem to be a reluctance in a lot of countries to kind of really look at the potential for short training courses, which can progress into longer courses, and they want to go straight towards longer courses, which are obviously, should be encouraged from a quality perspective. But given the shortage of trained practitioners right now, there is an urgent need to kind of address it in a more practical way, and you'd hope that they can be building blocks progressing, say, towards a longer qualification. But that's definitely one of the things that we encounter as a barrier when discussing this with governments. And the other thing I just wanted to build on was, and Dija just said now around the Singapore training, because one of the things that struck me about their subsidy program, and I think it's the same with New Zealand, is they provide subsidies to non-state sector providers, but on the condition that they have a particular accreditation certification and that continuing professional development is in place. And I think in New Zealand, they also tag that practitioners need to be paid appropriately according to government salary scales, which I thought was a really interesting way to kind of tackle that low pay and unstable terms of employment, or at least an attempt to get around that. I haven't seen that in as many countries. But thanks.
Thank you so much. I think our next question for Dr. Yousafzai will hopefully build on this. So Dr. Yousafzai, what are the particular differences and challenges that come with cultivating specifically a youth-led ECCE workforce, and how similar or different might they be from some of the challenges made by both Ms. Pucha and Ms. Beaton-Day?
I think these challenges will obviously vary a little from context to context, but I think when we're specifically thinking about youth, we also need to think about the background and the context with which we're coming into these programs. It's often the case that this will be their first experience in the workforce. And at least in terms of the context of Pakistan, it was not only their first experience in the workforce, but they were often the first female members of their household being given that family support to seek employment outside of the family, to work outside of the home. And I think that comes with its own specific challenges of how do you orientate people in the first time in the workspace, first time out of their home? How do you build the confidence that they need to be able to then go from that training into running their own preschool classroom, and to engage with community members, to do the wealth of things that come with that role? And how do you ensure in that training that those that are supervising them have that sensitivity, the empathy that they need to layer in not only the core specific skills you need to be a good early childhood care educator, but also to have the soft skills that accompany just that growth that you need in those early years. So I think that there are some very sort of nuanced specificities that come with training a youth workforce. And then the other piece that I will touch upon here is to do with gender equity. And again, this will vary from context to context, but there are such great disparities in the context of Pakistan between women's participation in the workforce, women's economic, the recognition of women's economic roles. And there are lots and lots of barriers to that. And I think part of this is also has to be considered in the training and in the environment that you create for women to be able to run their own preschool classrooms. Which is to address some of those barriers that serve in terms of women, that serve as a barrier to women's participation in the workforce, and particularly for young women. So I think these are things that sort of have us involved much more in community sensitization, much more having community ownership over the young woman's role as she embarks on these careers pathways as well.
Thank you, Dr. Yousafzai. I think the points you made, especially the latter point about gender inequities and expectations and community sensitization is really, I think, the landscape for helping promote some of these youth-led ECC programming. And we're really interested to know how these different features and elements and enablers vary based on context. So hoping to hear from Dr. Panguta next, but before we do, any reflections?
I might jump in. And maybe a good segue, as you say, Alia, with in terms of the Colombian context, one of the major conversations we have there is, the role of male participation in the promotion, right, of the model from an equity perspective. And I just would love to hear a little bit more, Aisha, how those conversations happen in the context. What is the role sort of males as the counterparts in either one or more elements of the design of the engagement with communities, families, etc.
So I think in terms of the work we did within communities, part of it was identifying who the communities would feel comfortable with and who would they trust in terms of that role as in early childhood care and education. And this is seems to be distinct in what the community was responding for these early years compared with perhaps primary school years, where there are male teachers. It is the norm, it is very commonplace. But in terms of for this specific age group, or for the introduction of this program, there seemed to be a preference for a female educator. I think for us, that was not only based on community demand, but based on these very distinct disparities between women and young women and similar age group of men, participation in the workforce, what opportunities they had, particularly in rural communities, which I know will be very distinct and different if we were working in urban areas of Pakistan. So I think that those were the things that informed our thinking about the design. Having said that, I also recognize that the early childhood workforce is dominated by women, and there is going to be issues where we should be discussing greater equity, greater representation of genders in this workforce for multiple reasons. And I think how we move forward in these discussions is part and parcel of how we think about the early childhood workforce more broadly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yousafzai. I think with that, I would love to ask Dr. Panguta to expand on your earlier points and any considerations and adaptations to bringing youth-led ECCE programming and models to potentially the Colombian context. And given your experiences, what recommendations would you have for others interested in adapting similar models into their own country context?
Thank you so much for that question. Just again, as way of context, and to remind those who are joining us that we have been working with Colombia for a few years to adapt the LEAPS model that Aisha has been sharing with us from Pakistan to our country. And so, I think the word adaptation might be a little minimalistic because, I think we tend to think of an adaptation as simply taking a model, making a few adjustments and changes, and then implementing some form of that program elsewhere. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that part of what we do in this international kind of exchanges is to learn from one another, right? Understand and learn from the lessons learned, and that there's a lot of value to that. But I think what we want to do is push the field a little bit further than that and think of adaptation in a way that is much more ecological and systemic. And our hypothesis by doing that is that if we do that successfully, we are more likely, we hope, to increase the chances of scalability, sustainability, and uptake of these models, which is usually, I think, the challenge when we bring innovative models anywhere we go, not necessarily to low middle income countries, but anywhere we go. So, this process that we have been engaged in for a few years now has brought a lot of lessons. And I think the best way that I can maybe summarize that process of that systemic adaptation is maybe to position our process in three sort of key areas that we work on. One is what, right? What do we need to understand? What do we need to characterize in order to bring that model to a different country? Who are the partners, right? Who are the different sort of vantage points that we need to consider in those whats that we're trying to understand and characterize for that adaptation to happen? And kind of when, right? Where are those moments where during either the exploration of feasibility, of implementation and evaluation, do those voices need to come in, and how all that gets coordinated? So I might just take a few minutes to kind of unpack that. So if I go back to the what, we in Colombia have been looking at two main, let's say, macro categories. One is the characteristics of the system. And by what I mean the characteristics of the system, we are looking at early childhood development and education, and youth development and education as two different systems, interrelated, but two systems nonetheless. And then the other big what is the context. And we've been hearing a lot about that. And what are the characteristics of context that we need to understand, characterize, and coordinate with, right, when these models come in? At the risk of sounding a little bit like a laundry list, I just want to kind of mention what are the kind of domains of the system that we think are important. But it's not just a laundry list out of kind of random ideas that come together. This is really building on years, probably at least 20 years now of research on early childhood development and education systems that we now know matter, again, for sustainability, for quality, and for uptake. And those include the understanding of the public policy landscape, the governance, both at the national and subnational and local level, the data systems and coordination, of course, the standards and content. And for this, I think maybe a conversation for another talk or at some point today, co-constructing theories of change that really speak, right, to that, again, policy landscape. Of course, as we've been talking, all of the characteristics around training, support, and mentoring of the workforce, visions and guidelines around process and structural quality, areas of family and community involvement and participation, and again, guidelines for that, as well as, of course, sustainable financing, and kind of cross-cutting to all of that. What are the metrics for ensuring success of implementation and impact, right? So what we do is look sort of coming to do a mapping of what all of those systems characteristics are, again, from a child development and youth development perspective, to ensure that our model speaks and is well articulated, right, in those systems. And then for the second big what, which is the context, similarly, there's, I think all of us who are involved in implementation and programming know this well, but again, being very intentional about the characterization of sociodemographic and family profiles, the determination of needs, and how these models truly could meet those needs, as Aisha was telling us about earlier. What are those potential barriers, facilitators? What are the motivations for engaging or for not engaging with the way in which the model is proposed? Issues around health and human security that to us, both in Pakistan and Colombia, have big implications for how these models are presented and rolled out. And other things like attitudes towards possibly digital technologies, again, ideas that are novel, that might come in to disrupt those systems, have to be characterized from the context and from the bottom up. So that's kind of the big what's in terms of our first step for that quote unquote adaptation. Then from that comes the who, right? So from which different perspective? It's not just our responsibility, or it's not on us to characterize everything and interpret the information. So we actually engage in a dialogue with those actors that we have identified, and that they go all the way from private public partners in Colombia, the academic community in Colombia, in our case, much like in Pakistan as well. And ultimately, of course, the mentors, the youth, the families, and the communities who are part of the program. They have to be co-researchers, co-constructors of the entire process. And that's another big area that we are trying to, again, push the field towards in a way that's more systematic and robust. And finally, in terms of the when, I mean, all these processes happen at different moments. I think for purposes of being able to operationalize and manage a program of this and an effort of this magnitude, we do kind of look at this into phases. So, you know, we ran a feasibility study, much like in Pakistan. We have a formative phase that, for example, comes in to actually do specific modifications based on our findings of feasibility. But also, you know, the idea is to ask all these questions about the system and the context constantly during implementation, as well as during the evaluation, not just the impact, but also during the process and possibly the formative evaluation phases of the project. And so I think with that, I might have given you enough of an idea of, again, our kind of paradigm on adaptation as we see it from a multi-stakeholder, multi-phase, and again, multi-domain perspective in the context of youth-led early childhood programs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Panguta, for that. I think that framework, especially having that explicit framework guide you through those different contexts, is super, super helpful. I tried taking some notes down as you went, but that was very helpful. Does anyone have any thoughts before we move to Ms. Beaton-Day?
I just want to reiterate one of the things that I think was really critical in what Angie was saying, which was that here we're talking about two constituents, young children and youth, and it's really important we look within a country as what is the motivations and the systems for each of them if we're going to really have traction for this type of model. And I think what Angie articulated was really doing that mapping to understand the system for the systems around youth as well as the systems around young children, to look at where the levers are to build the model for scale and sustainability.
Absolutely. I think all points made too were revolved around and regarding the importance of including relevant stakeholders, right? And that also brings me to our final question for Ms. Beaton-Day, which is, given your work on implementation of ECD operations for the World Bank, what were some of the key considerations? And again, Dr. Panguta touched on this a bit, for prioritizing and advancing agendas related to youth-led ECCE at the World Bank and generally. Do you think these strategies like this support youth economic empowerment, and could this be an investment case advocated for with governments?
Thanks. And yes, definitely is the kind of short answer. But I think what we've seen is in recent years a really rapid expansion of demand for both ECD programs as well as skills training and employment programs. Like these are both priority topics in many countries, and especially with in the kind of context of the COVID-19 recovery, employment in particular is really front of mind, and with young women and youth is a really strong part of that. And I think it gives us an opportunity to convey the win-win investment opportunity for governments and talk about how with a single investment, you can basically address both of these critical aspects. So by combining, integrating an ECD training track, for example, into a skills training employment program, you tackle multiple important issues at once, and you're able to increase employment for vulnerable groups, including women and youth, as well as build the ECD workforce with kind of quality services in mind. I think we've certainly found that the Liberia case has really resonated with people. So we've been working on that, as you guys know, for a few years. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of integrating ECD training into a skills and employment program, which is targeting vulnerable adolescent girls. And the results coming out of that give us a really strong platform to make the case for investment in other countries. So we've had 3 rounds so far, and we've just finished an RCT, but the results around income, ECD deployment, and broader kind of empowerment factors for women. I don't want to go too far with that, but there are some really strong findings coming out which are really compelling to governments. And we haven't yet had the results back from the child development outcomes and the quality of the learning services compared to what exists in Liberia at the moment, but we're expecting that to come soon, and hopefully that will also be a positive case and will help to bring it together and strengthen the case for investment. We're starting to see quite strong demand from other countries. So there's been ongoing dialogues around this, but sort of maybe limited traction to date, although there's been a lot of interest. But India has picked up this model. There's about to be a new project in Somalia, which will essentially work on a similar model. There have been a couple of other countries which have looked at it, but actually for some reason or another, it hasn't been appropriate. So I think the importance of assessing the market and really understanding, Aisha mentioned it earlier, kind of the motivations in the system for kind of both sets of groups, as well as kind of the overall market demand is really important. There have been a few blockages. So in Bhutan, there was a blockage around, that was one example where the Ministry of Labour kind of wanted to keep hold of Ministry of Education wanted to keep hold of the training, wasn't prepared to make kind of courses available and training opportunities available. So it scuppered the Ministry of Labour's intentions to roll out something similar. And in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, they undertook an assessment, and actually they found that there wasn't the demand for services, and there wasn't these specific type of services, and there wasn't, for various reasons, a kind of a clear pathway for women, for kind of young girls taking this on. It was due to various different cultural concerns, as well as the structure within the Ministry of Education and how they structure their training programs. They're still really interested, but there will need to be kind of several different structural changes to kind of make something like this possible, and to make sure that there is a clear market. So I think it's to say there's a lot of interest. Hopefully in another kind of 6 to 12 months, we'll have even more practical examples to draw from. But there are also some really interesting cases which I think we can learn from, where it hasn't quite worked, and actually understanding why that's happened is equally helpful, and making sure that countries really do go through a process of conducting an assessment and looking at the whole value chain and making sure this is something that will work, I think is really, really important. yeah, let me pause there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think what you said about different ministerial buy-ins and sponsorships are so tricky to navigate when you have that being either a shared responsibility between ministries or completely siphoned off and siloed, and sort of navigating that is so case by case. And I think that is something I think about quite a lot and is super interesting. Any reflections before I hand over to Han to close us off with our final discussion?
So maybe this is really just a general question or reflection, which I'd love to hear from others around, which is, as evidence is, as we grow the evidence around this type of model, both, and as Fran mentioned, where it has traction and where it might be difficult to start such a program. I'd be curious to know what else we should be measuring. I mean, I think we're all as a community fairly confident about what we're measuring at the preschool level, at the child development level. But in addition to income and employment, what is it that we should be better at measuring at the youth level that might help build the evidence in a meaningful way? What could that look like? What constructs should we be targeting?
I think that's a really great point. We tried to do it in a very limited way with the Liberia case, and we looked at a couple of different tools for measuring, for example, well-being and kind of other aspects of economic empowerment around financial inclusion and social integration, so kind of the strength of social networks. But I wouldn't say we were as comfortable with the tools that were available, and kind of that we really felt like we had a really strong grasp that these were the right. Sorry if you can hear my toddler in the background. she went mental when she realized I was on a video call. She wanted to be part of it. But yeah, so I think there's a big piece around that, and kind of certainly a takeaway from us is just to kind of delve into those tools in a bit more detail and try and figure out what the most appropriate tools and ways are of examining that kind of aspect. And I think the other piece that we didn't do, which I think we should have done on reflection, is more follow-ups from family members and boyfriends, husbands, to understand their perceptions and to what extent, if any, the program had an impact on the way that they think about female employment, and particularly those around them. So I think those are two learnings for us, or at least things that we would like to explore more in the future.
That's similar in the work that we did, where I think we got some very nice qualitative data on other community members' perceptions of this workforce, but we are not entirely satisfied with maybe the measurements selected for aspects of autonomy, empowerment, decision-making, both in terms of cultural relevance to the way these questions are traditionally framed, but also, I think, whether they're targeting this youth age group well as well. So I think those will be challenges as we go forward.
One other thing that I might add from sort of the kind of global experience that we've had with the Workforce Initiative is also, in addition to income, kind of thinking about how to understand both kind of financial and non-financial benefits, and how both are kind of important in understanding job satisfaction and things like retention. So also collecting some of that data around non-financial benefits too could be helpful in painting that broader picture.
To say, if there's interest, we'd certainly be very happy to share the survey that we used. I think you've probably used better tools, but if there's interest in kind of getting a kind of like sharing some examples of tools and trying to trying to build on what others have done to figure out how we can strengthen that particular aspect. And we'd certainly be very, very happy to engage in that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'd be happy to do that as well, just to share and exchange what worked and what did work, what we think worked and what we think worked less well.
That'd be super helpful.
Yeah, I think that's actually really something that I've been thinking through as well. And I guess, especially as I hear from the world, like representing from the World Bank perspective, just the different priorities, because I know that we've been grappling with the balance between, having this kind of standardized measurement and having like the proper tools that we want to be utilizing, but at the same time, incorporating, what is culturally, really being humble to that context. And I think that it's been something to think about extensively, especially as we go forward and pushing the ECCE and ECD research that we're kind of taking in so many different directions and so many different contexts, and really amplifying that to prioritize that. And so I think that it adds a lot and to the conversation, as well as to student researchers and our future research plans. So thank you for sharing that.
I think, Han, with that, we'll be ready for our final discussion question and we can wrap up.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing such wonderful perspectives with us. As we conclude today's discussion, we just want to end with a general question for anyone and everyone to participate in. We wanted to ask if you could change one aspect of how these programs were or currently are being carried out in your context that you work in. What would that be and why? And perhaps this could include some of the barriers and facilitators that might contribute to forming, implementing, or scaling up the program.
So maybe I'll start us off. I think there are two things which I wish we had been able to do more of. So in the program, we had an annual youth conference, which enabled all of the youth to get together. One year, and the next year it was completely messed up by the pandemic. But at least in the first year, it seemed to be very successful. And I think having more opportunities like that, like a community of learning where youth could gather on a monthly basis, on a regular basis at least, would be really, really helpful in their own growth and in finding a sense of camaraderie. And I know that technology is one option to leverage that, but again, in our context, there's a lower number of women that had access to their own phone that they could control. So I think that sort of took that option out from us. And the second thing, I think, is to building on a point that I think others have made at the start of this conversation, was that ensuring that we get their training recognized. And again, Pakistan has, at this point, a number of different institutions which can award a certificate for early childhood care and education. And this is something that's relatively new, which doesn't rely upon a degree. So it's allowing for a mixture of different levels. And so I think that would be our next step that we would want to consider.
I'm happy to follow on that as well. In our experience in Colombia, I think I talked quite a bit about areas of visibility and giving the space to co-construct and hear voices. I don't know that the incentives for funding are quite there for those processes to happen. And I realize that there is an urgency to implement, right? We're talking about generations of children and youth as we speak, right? That, don't have the luxury of waiting for 1 year, right? To be able to access the opportunities that our models, offer. At the same time, I do think that there has to be a space for innovation to happen with all of those elements and characteristics that I think we have been speaking about, for the research to happen in a way that, again, measures the right construct, that does the right thing, and that is intensive. So I do think that from a research and development perspective, I hope the field moves towards really focusing on implementation science as a twin investment, not just implementation alone and impact alone, but what does that, what are the right questions and what are the right processes? Which, just to end, it links to the prior question on measurement. And it is, I think this was really, I have to admit, an artifact of COVID, because we were not able to go out in the field as fast as we could. As we should. We had to sort of take that additional time and almost rethink our entire theory of change in the case of Colombia. So for us, the metrics, the contents, the indicators, the measures map onto that very comprehensive and large theory of change, but that did take quite a bit of time and effort. And because of the fact that we have very, committed and talented champions in Colombia for this model, we were lucky to be able to have it. But I don't know that structurally, again, the funding mechanisms are there to allow for that. So that's one area that, as we all are advocates for the fields of both child and youth development, that I hope we can really rally around, to be sure that the models are of the highest quality, that the evidence is of the best quality, and ultimately that the models are truly sustainable and scalable over time.
I think maybe from my side, building on the scaling point, I think one of the things that's become really apparent to us in Liberia is the need to find like the right institutional anchor for this. It's not necessarily always where we'd expect it. So we've had amazing engagement from the Ministry of Education throughout this program. The program used to be part of the Ministry of Gender, but they really didn't have capacity and resources to be able to scale it up. And the Ministry of Education has been very strongly engaged and essentially is taking it on. But actually they're quite limited in the way that they can take it on, because a lot of the market, or a lot of the training is actually gearing up towards non-state sector services. And the Ministry for Education actually has a limited, I guess, like there's only so much they can invest in that particular area. And there isn't kind of a clear pathway to scale right now within the Ministry for Education itself. And in the meantime, there are other great programs across Liberia which are focusing on youth and skills and employment, coming at it from a different angle, which actually this could integrate into as well, and potentially have a much wider impact, a much bigger scale through that program. But there's now going to be kind of competition between the two ministries if we kind of go down that approach. So it's basically to say it's a slightly messy situation at the moment, and in some ways it's with the right institutional anchor, and in other respects it's the pathway to scale is quite challenging. And I think this is going to be one of those programs that also one of these approaches that across different countries is always going to be a bit tricky to find the right institutional anchor and figure out like who needs to be involved, who needs to lead it, and kind of where the best opportunities are for scale. And I don't think we've cracked that yet in Liberia, but it will certainly be something that's at the top of our mind as we approach this in other countries. But that's something we're definitely grappling with.
Thank you so much, everyone, for really participating.